instantly claiming central dominion. This opening move prioritizes control over the d-file and sets the stage for rapid development. Developing a knight to f6 immediately prepares for central pawn play, and often leads to dynamic, unbalanced positions. Establishing central presence and preparing kingside development, this move immediately contests the center's dominion. Opening the path for the queen and bishop solidifies central control, though it temporarily hinders the dark-squared bishop's development. Developing the knight to f3 solidifies the center and prepares for castling, a prudent step in this queen's Indian setup. Forces white to develop another piece, potentially disrupting their harmonious setup with this unexpected check. Shielding the queen and preparing for queenside expansion, this develops a piece while maintaining flexibility. Challenging white's kingside pawn structure, this advance boldly stakes a claim on the queenside, aiming to disrupt the opponent's development and create future imbalances. Solidifying the queenside and denying black immediate queenside expansion, this push forces a decision regarding the bishop's activity. Solidifying the bishop's placement and preparing for castling offers a calm development, aiming to reinforce the queenside's defensive structure. Seizing central territory, white boldly stakes a claim with the pawn advance, aiming to unlock diagonal lines for the queen and potentially open the e-file for future piece activity. The central pawn thrust liberates black's game and directly contests white's ambition to dominate the center, potentially forcing exchanges that simplify the position and offer black active piece play. Pushing the pawn forward creates a central pawn chain, asserting dominance over the d5 square and restricting black's knight's options, while simultaneously opening a diagonal for white's queen. Nurturing the knight's retreat, this repositioning aims to relieve the pawn's pressure, freeing up squares for central expansion and preparing a potential kingside fianchetto, while cautiously observing the pawn chain's forward march. Centering the bishop here prepares castling and reinforces the kingside, aiming to exploit the slight disorganization black's knight retreat has caused in pawn structure. Expect a king's Indian-like battle to unfold. Challenging white's central grip, this move aggressively contests the d4 pawn and seeks to open lines for black's pieces, potentially leading to a dynamic battle where pawn structure becomes paramount. Safeguarding the monarch now allows white to consolidate the central advantage and prepare for pawn advancements, potentially opening lines for the rooks and aiming for kingside pressure. This develops the knight to its most active square, immediately challenging white's central pawn structure and preparing to defend the d5 outpost. The knight's new position aims to participate in the queenside pawn storm while also potentially eyeing the kingside if the opportunity arises. Fortifying the kingside's safety, the rook now joins the central struggle, preparing to exploit potential weaknesses in black's pawn structure should they overextend. Exchanging pawns here relinquishes central control and opens the d-file, potentially for white's rook, but it also simplifies the position and offers black an active bishop diagonal after recapture. Striking at the center, this capture decisively clears the d-file, potentially opening avenues for white's rooks, and creating a central pawn mass that demands black's immediate attention. Reclaiming the pawn with the knight, black aims to reshape the central pawn structure and challenge white's immediate spatial advantage. This knight maneuver cleverly sidesteps the open c-file and eyes the d3 bishop, potentially forcing it to a less active square or creating tactical opportunities. It's a dynamic response, suggesting black is prepared for a sharp middle game where piece activity and tactical skirmishes will be paramount. The knight on c5 is a good outpost, controlling important squares and potentially disrupting white's harmonious development. Sharpening the pressure, the bishop's repositioning directly targets the knight on c5, creating a pin that significantly restricts its defensive options and hints at a potential future exchange sacrifice on d5 if black isn't careful. Sensing an opportunity to activate the queen and potentially disrupt white's center, black boldly brings the queen into the fray, aiming to reclaim the pawn and create dynamic play. This injection of queen power demands white's immediate attention and complicates the pawn structure, setting the stage for a sharp battle where precise calculation will be paramount. Unleashing the knight to a central outpost, this maneuver not only gains space, but also prepares to challenge black's queen and potentially dismantle their pawn structure, setting the stage for a dynamic struggle where piece activity will be paramount. Securing the monarch amidst the storm provides essential safety, allowing the pieces to regroup and contemplate their next coordinated thrust after the bishop's positional probing. Piercing the queenside with the knight opens up a dynamic threat, aiming to disrupt black's pawn structure and potentially expose the king. Boldly confronting the knight's advanced post, black repositions the queen to exploit the central vacuum created by white's doubled pawns, simultaneously preparing to contest the now open queen's file and potentially launch a counterattack against the lightly defended kingside. The queen trade simplifies the position, a pragmatic choice to avoid further complications arising from the advanced d-pawn and black's active queen, initiating a positional game with a focus on piece activity and pawn structure rather than immediate tactical fireworks. The rook's occupation of the b3 square introduces a significant long-term threat, aiming to exploit the now compromised queenside pawn structure and create weaknesses that could blossom into a decisive advantage. Securing the rook's active outpost and preparing for central pawn pushes to open lines for piece activity. The rook's redeployment to the b-file seeks to contest control of this open file, a crucial objective now that the queens have been exchanged, and the middle game phase is solidifying around pawn structures and piece activity. Unlocking the c-file for potential infiltration, this bishop maneuver simultaneously prepares to challenge black's d5 outpost and solidifies white's central influence, hinting at a future pawn storm or targeted piece pressure. Securing the rook on its accustomed thoroughfare, black shores up defensive integrity and prepares to contest the open file, a crucial staging point for future operations. Securing the central d-file for both rooks creates an undeniable pressure point, aiming to unravel black's somewhat passive setup and exploit any lingering weaknesses around the monarch. Developing the bishop to d7 solidifies the pawn chain and prepares for the eventual deployment of the king's rook to a more active file, aiming to contest the open lines that white has meticulously constructed. Unleashing pressure along the c-file, the bishop repositions to actively contest black's control and threaten infiltration, aiming to exploit the now exposed queenside structure and coordinate with the rooks for a strategic advantage. The knight's journey to c5 aims to disrupt white's central control and potentially create weaknesses. Reclaiming the knight from its isolated outpost at b6 and centralizing it to d4 immediately tightens white's grip on the d-file, reinforcing the pawn chain and preparing for further positional advances. Re-establishing piece equality, this knight hops back to a more active square, threatening immediate disruption by aiming at white's central pawn structure and preparing for potential infiltrations. The exchange on d4 immediately simplifies the position, but the crucial element is white's regained control of the central files, particularly the d-file now that the defender of the d-pawn is eliminated. This action proactively seeks to exploit the slightly exposed position of black's queen and aims to open lines for white's rooks to become active. A brave attempt to snag the weak pawn on d4, but it risks isolating the bishop and leaves the knight without support, potentially leading to a passive position if white can organize a central push or pressure the kingside. Unlocking the queenside pawn's potential becomes paramount after consolidating the central structure. However, this retreat allows black's bishop to enjoy a commanding diagonal influence, potentially dictating the flow of play by eyeing weak squares. The game has transitioned into a phase where black's knight on c5, despite its past activity, now finds itself isolated and potentially vulnerable to white's centralized pieces, particularly after this exchange, which aims to alleviate some of black's spatial pressure by simplifying the board. Reclaiming the bishop solidifies white's central presence and prepares to contest the now open d-file. Repositioning the rook to the open d-file now challenges white's doubled rooks and aims to disrupt their centralized control. This move signals a shift in focus, relinquishing the initiative on the central files and instead aiming to improve bishop placement. White seeks to achieve a more comfortable pawn structure and potentially prepare for a favorable trade that simplifies the position into an endgame where the queens are off the board, potentially leveraging the superior mobility of its minor pieces. Suddenly, the knight's daring thrust to d3 creates a remarkable positional pickle, forcing white to address the imminent threat to their king's safety and potentially disrupting their coordination. Clearing the b3 square immediately simplifies the position, trading off black's active queen and paving the way for a potential pawn push up the kingside. Finally, the tension on the d-file is resolved, and black's rook penetrates deep into white's position. Securing the e-pawn's advance, this knight repositions to pressure black's queenside pawn structure and potentially tie down the d3 bishop. The pawn's march to a4 now creates a secure outpost for the knight on c5, effectively pinning that flank and preventing any immediate counterplay from white's remaining pieces. Solidifying the pawn chain to prevent further pawn breaks, white establishes a more robust defensive structure, although it does subtly commit the king's pawn cover. Finally, the bishop finds a more active square, aiming to disrupt white's central pawn structure and potentially unleash threats against the queenside. Unlocking the advanced outpost on d6, white aims to anchor a knight deep in black's territory, disrupting pawn formations and eyeing potential weaknesses, especially the vulnerable c5 square. Unleashing the f-pawn signals a desire to contest the central d-file and potentially open lines for the g8 knight, aiming to alleviate the pressure black has been experiencing on the queenside. Gaining a rook for a knight so deep in black's territory is a daring gambit, aiming to disrupt their coordination and create chaos on the queenside. Reclaiming the b8 square allows the bishop to finally escape its cramped position and actively participate in the game, potentially targeting white's somewhat exposed king. Unleashing the pawn from its protective file, this capture aims to shatter black's pawn structure and potentially open lines towards their king, which, while currently safe, could become a target if black missteps in the ensuing simplification. Opening the kingside pawn structure creates a jagged, weak perimeter around the monarch, sacrificing its protective shield for a potentially open avenue of attack. Yet the immediate danger comes not from direct assault, but from the positional unraveling that is now inevitable, as white's pieces will find new avenues to exploit the fragmented defenses. The knight's journey to b6 offers a subtle positional squeeze, aiming to restrict black's pieces and potentially create weaknesses on the queenside. Grasping the knight's advanced position and realizing its precariousness, black initiates a fascinating repositioning of their bishop. This maneuver aims to contest the central diagonal once more and potentially untangle the pieces, offering a fresh perspective on the board's ongoing positional struggle. Securing the monarch's safety becomes paramount. Repositioning the king behind pawns offers a crucial defensive shield against potential latent threats lurking on the open files. Unlocking the queenside and preparing for an active pawn push, this foray aims to disrupt white's rook placement and potentially open lines for the rook on d3. Recapturing the pawn on c1 seems like a natural reaction, but it neglects the more pressing issue of black's e-pawn marching forward, threatening to disrupt white's pawn structure and open lines. The piece on b3 is also a constant annoyance, supported by the bishop, creating an awkward position for white's knight. Consider how to address these threats before solidifying your pawn structure. A bold gambit to inject life into a static position, this exchange sacrifices the rook for a pawn, aiming to destabilize white's pawn structure and potentially activate black's queen, though it leaves the king potentially exposed if white can consolidate effectively. A bold repositioning of the knight, seeking to exploit potential weaknesses on the queenside while simultaneously creating an escape square for itself. The rook's relocation to d3 injects a fresh tactical spark into the position, challenging white's queenside pawn structure and creating immediate threats against the isolated pawn on a4. This audacious maneuver aims to disrupt black's coordination and exploit the slightly exposed white king. A decisive tactic hinges on exploiting the discovered attack against black's king, forcing material gain and a significantly improved position. The black king steps into an active, albeit exposed, central position, aiming to disrupt white's attacking formation and potentially become a participant in the ensuing middle game skirmishes rather than remaining a passive target. The knight's repositioning to e4 aims to disrupt black's recently unified pawn structure, potentially creating weaknesses on the king side and offering new attacking avenues. Relocating the rook to the 7th rank aims to establish a strong outpost and potentially disrupt white's coordination, hinting at a desire to activate the king and exploit the open files for counterplay. Unleashing potential on the king side opens avenues for attack, aiming to exploit the king's exposed position and perhaps even establish control of that crucial kingside majority. The bishop now activates from its passive outpost on b3, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure and create counterplay on the queen side. The knight leaps forward, initiating a sharp tactical sequence that forces the black king into a more exposed position, potentially creating opportunities to exploit the weakened pawn structure around it. Relocating the monarch offers respite from the knight's invasive presence, but it leaves him exposed on this open flank, a potential target for future onslaughts. Saddling the g-pawn with the task of defending the king, white seeks to exploit the exposed black monarch's position. A desperate attempt to stir up complications by luring the king into the open, but the unleashed checks offer little lasting advantage given the opponent's solid setup. The monarch's forced march to safety, finally, brings a flicker of breathing room after a chaotic skirmish across the board. The bishop slides onto the d4 square, a seemingly passive repositioning, yet it subtly anchors the center and prepares to support a potential kingside advance by the pawn chain, while also keeping an eye on the weakened white king which, despite the seeming safety, has seen many pieces exchanged around it.